On January 23, 1898, Michael Eisenstein, a well-established architect in the city of Riga, was given a son. It's this very baby who 29 years later was to become the first person to conceive a film of Marx's Das Kapital, after a script by Marx himself. It's still unknown up to this day whether the extreme low temperature of this night in January 1898, one of the coldest in the whole century, had any bearing on Eisenstein's failure 30 years later. Anyway, Eisenstein's notes for a film of Das Kapital, now published, show that filming Das Kapital was not just a vague idea pulled out of a magician's hat during a vodka marathon. It was a project carefully considered, intensively discussed, partially researched, and tentatively planned. Seeking a way to make the viewer think dialectically, that's why Deleuze nicknamed him the cinematographic Hegel, Eisenstein was focusing on the worker and the bowl of soup prepared by his wife while he was producing capital at the factory. For Eisenstein, the worker's wife was one of the major threats to the revolution, since she was preventing him from being hungry, and therefore revolutionary. Today, things have dramatically shifted. The angels of capitalism have figured out great ways to feed our stomachs and brains in order to keep us quiet. The central political issue of the day is not what should be done anymore, but where can I find a fitness club that accepts my credit card? Despite the efforts and ideas on how to adapt Marx's script, Eisenstein's project failed, both because Das Kapital was simply too much of a subject and because Stalin had decided to stop the smart young man. This initial failure, for whatever reason, might have triggered a whole series of failures throughout the world and the century, and even beyond. First, communism didn't last too long. 72 years. That's what it took for communism to fail, or rather the wall to fall. From Bishkek to Sofia, the experience of defeat has become the only horizon, and the bowl of soup is back on the workers' table. In the end, alienation in spite of liberation was not the solution. The specter might still be roaming around, but we, proud individuals and capitalist subjects, are not afraid of ghosts, are we? Even if communism didn't really fail, but was rather abused by a drunk husband, the idea of its failure has been made so irresistible that no one can seriously oppose it. Then, social democracy, or the quasi-utopian program outlined in Sweden in the 1930s and applied to Scandinavian countries, seemed to offer a better product for a cheaper price. The great modernist project, which experienced so many difficulties under totalitarian regimes, was here fully and successfully applied. The state managed to get rid of poverty and to become one of the world's wealthiest. To achieve this miracle, the state had to sneak into any aspect of both public and private lives, organizing, rewarding, punishing, and ruling in a general consent. Yet the social order that characterized Swedish life ended up being quite repressive. The individual was strangled and suffocated for the sake of social comfort and in the name of a better tomorrow. It's even surprising that Sweden, with its soft yet constant, thorough and efficient repression, never produced any violent nutcases like Jack the Ripper, Baruch Goldstein, or Marc Dutroux. At this point, social democracy is failing as well. In Sweden, as in any other country in the world, it's been smashed by the steamroller of global capitalism. Get rich or get lost. Social democracy is dissolving in the wake of global capitalism, for it's hard to resist the logic of accumulation of capital and to lose the sense of one's very private interest. If you're not convinced, just look at the laundry situation in Sweden. Instead of having a washing machine in each apartment, the state ruled that there would be a common laundry room in each building and that the tenants would simply book a time slot. Sounds great, doesn't it? But a few decades later, fights over the laundry facility have become daily business, and that's probably the only thing that might make a Swede lose his temper and unpack the machine gun. The common facility has become a mere battlefield, and you'd better enter in full combat gear. The same happens if you look at the gardens, which used to be communal, without separation between public and private space. Today, fences have been erected in order to mark private property, and the open, progressive architecture that constitutes the Swedish suburbs is denied in its essence. Even the idea of the garden has been corrupted, as the worst housing projects in Sweden bear names like Rose Garden, Apple Garden, and Cherry Hill, revealing the powerlessness of the social democratic ideal. Today, Utopia's remnants are made available worldwide by IKEA, the multi-million-dollar company that's still 100% controlled by the rich landowner's son and former Nazi, Ingvar Kamprad. In the end, it's just a matter of time. In principle, the system is already gone. The only hope left over is to be found far away from Sweden, namely in South Africa. During the years of apartheid, Swedish social democracy was the major role model for non-communist ANC members. Many of them considered the Swedish system fit to be implemented after the fall of apartheid. Sweden was the biggest and most efficient supporter of the ANC, to the point that South African intelligence services had to get rid of Olof Palme, and with him, of a certain idea of social democracy. Now, the guys who planned the Olof Palme killing are desperate mercenaries in Congo and Iraq, while their ex-future victims are ruling South Africa. And all enjoy IKEA furniture and its affordable version of the modernist dream. Victoria's capitalism is now unchallenged and full of itself, parading like an arrogant peacock in a brand new suit. And it can never call it a day and rest on its achievements. It has to expand ceaselessly, like a restless workaholic. Lenin's apartment in Moscow is now a gift shop, and Eisenstein's birth house in Riga could become a Burger King. We wear H&M and Nike, eat McDonald's, drink Coca-Cola, watch CNN, furnish IKEA, fly EasyJet, enjoy Prozac, and don't smoke Marlboros anymore. We are free people in a free world. Enjoy free market and free time. Freedom is awesome. Yet we know that capitalism will fail as well. It will smash, crash, and eventually turn kaput. Soon the ruins of capitalism will join the wreckage of communism in the post-utopian cemetery of failed political systems. You might argue that capitalism can't fail. Right. But hasn't capitalism already failed for 90% of the world's population? So the failure we're looking at here is the final failure, the last quake, the cherry on the cake. And we will not be able to say that we've been taken by surprise. Adam Smith, the early promoter of free trade, had warned us about the deep contradictions inherent to capitalism, which might lead to an ultimate crisis. But no one paid attention, up to yesterday, preferring the comforting sound of his praise of capitalism. Even Hegel, in his philosophy of right, was closely following Adam Smith, while summing up these contradictions in famous formulas, saying it was a world of both great wealth and great poverty. So one day, perhaps tomorrow, who knows, stocks will dramatically drop, a panic attack will hit the city, planes will be grounded, communications will be cut, gas stations and supermarkets will be looted, billionaires will become homeless, prison gates will be opened, car bombs will blow up, the emergency state will be declared, the National Guard will be called in, Afghanistan and Sri Lanka will offer their support, the financial district will become the deadly playground of rats and gangs, there will be no items left to buy or sell. Even the fitness clubs will be shut down. In other words, dialectics of history in action. Probably a great script idea if Eisenstein was still among us. In the house adjoining Eisenstein's birth house in Riga, Isaiah Berlin was born. The upcoming political philosopher and historian of ideas emigrated to Britain in 1921, the year Mikhail Eisenstein passed away. Isaiah Berlin didn't exactly become a communist, as you can figure out. He was once confused with Irving Berlin, the American composer who probably had a slightly lower IQ than Isaiah Berlin. Winston Churchill invited the latter for lunch, thinking he was the former. So Isaiah Berlin wasn't there, since he was replaced by Irving Berlin, whose real name was actually not even Irving Berlin, but Israel Balin, an emigre from Tsarist Russia who made it from the Lower East Side gutter to an Upper East Side condo, writing plenty of songs without knowing how to play the piano or how to read music. He employed arrangers to transcribe the pulsing melodies and often complex harmonies that poured out of his head and through his clumsy fingers. This said, he wrote some of the most famous tunes ever, like White Christmas or God Bless America. As the title suggests, he was not exactly driven by a progressive force. A hardcore conservative and lifelong Republican, he gave to a lot of war charities, hence Lady Churchill's desire to thank him, while Winston thought he was having lunch with the other one. Harry Warren, an Italian-born song plugger who became Hollywood's top song maker, said of Irving Berlin in 1944, during the Allied air assault on Germany, "They bombed the wrong Berlin." This brings us back to the infamous London lunch, which took place just before the Allied bombs and Warren's comment, when one Berlin was taken for another. Mrs. Churchill said to Winston, "Irving Berlin is in town and he's been very generous to us. If you meet him, do tell him we're very pleased with him." Mr. Churchill said, "I want him to come to lunch." She said, No, I did not mean that. I mean, if you meet him in the Churchill Club, just pat him on the shoulder and say we're very grateful to him." "I want him to come to lunch," he said, but she couldn't understand why. So, Irving Berlin sat next to Winston Churchill, who said to him, "Mr. Berlin, what is the most important piece of work you've done for us lately, in your opinion?" Poor Berlin obviously couldn't quite make out what this man had said. After some hesitation, "I don't know, it'd be a White Christmas, I guess." And Winston Churchill said, "Are you an American?" Berlin said, "What? Why, yes." Then Churchill again turned to Irving Berlin and he said, "Do you think Roosevelt will be re-elected this year?" Irving said, "Well, in the past I had voted for him myself. This year I'm not so sure." At this point, Churchill became rather gloomy. He couldn't understand who he was dealing with. He obviously still thought it was Isaiah Berlin, the political philosopher. Finally, he said, "Mr. Berlin, when do you think the European war is going to end?" Berlin said, "Sir, I shall never forget this moment. When I go back to my own country, I shall tell my children and my children's children that in the spring of 1944, the Prime Minister of Great Britain asked me when the European war was going to end." Churchill was very displeased about this. He really more or less lost his temper and got up. Lunch was over. 27 years before, another Berlin was the city where Eisenstein's parents moved to after the revolution. It looked like an obvious choice for upper-class German-speaking Latvians who were unable to accept the October Revolution. Even Richard Wagner, the most Germanic of all German composers, has had his time in Latvia. He spent almost 2 years in Riga between 1837 and 1839 and was the musical director of the Riga German Theater. According to legend, he found the inspiration for The Flying Dutchman on the stormy Baltic Sea when he was leaving Riga, in a depressed state of mind due to unpaid debts. Latvia has had a few hours of independence between 1918 and 1940, and again since 1991. Yet they're like dots in a broad landscape, hardly distinguishable on the Brodelian long-term timeline of history. Once nicknamed the Paris of the North, Riga could sooner be dubbed Nanook Vienna. But does it really matter? Paris and Vienna are the two cities which had their climax roughly between Eisenstein's and Isaiah Berlin's births, and never quite recovered from their past glory. Today they can only sell the crumbs of their empire as a cultural commodity and offer a Disneyfied version of their grandeur to the visitor. By the way, Israel Balin, who became Irving Berlin thanks to the mistake of a record cover printer and not the unleashed imagination of a zealous Ellis Island immigration officer, was not born in Riga, but in a remote town in Siberia. He set foot on American soil in the years when capitalism still meant the promise of a golden future, easily reachable for hard workers and lucky folks. If Balin were to immigrate today, he would probably die frozen in the line in front of the U.S. consulate in Vladivostok. But if the rewards of capitalism have dramatically shrunk, its promises remain obviously unchanged. Global capitalism feeds the people. It's the eighth wonder of the world, a light unto the nations, and the answer to everybody's prayers. What's great about America is the greatness of its gross national product. Yet seduction is a matter of illusion. The Bible has replaced the Constitution, and war on terror has taken the place of struggle for liberty. Barbarism in Washington doesn't dress itself in the costumes of Al-Qaeda. It wears instead the smooth, shaven smile of a Senate resolution sold to the highest bidder. Yet the failure of American democracy, or democracy in America, had been announced at least a century and a half ago by Tocqueville, the compulsory reference of all American presidents since Eisenhower, who quote him constantly without spending too much time reading him. Self-interest, well understood, Tocqueville argued, is the moral doctrine best suited to the needs of modern democratic life. Of course, we could update Tocqueville's statement. Ruthless self-promotion is the moral doctrine best suited to the needs of the global market. Benjamin Franklin, 100 years before, was saying nothing different, distinguishing greed as the main drive of capitalism. Even Charles Dickens, in his American Notes for a General Circulation, saw nothing but the overall failure of the very modern utopia promised by America and its institutions. He saw the third failure outlined already long before we were born. As a matter of fact, Isaiah Berlin's famous lecture from 1958, entitled Two Concepts of Liberty, should become compulsory reading in Washington. It would show our rulers, if they manage to read it, that they find themselves dealing with a negative liberty, the kind of constraint-free idleness which leads straight to disaster. Was it the free market that hijacked the airplanes and promoted them into postmodern bombs? Was it Adam Smith's invisible hand that cut the throats of the pilots on what they thought was a flight to Los Angeles? History apparently is still a work in progress, carrying the promise of the future crash, the grand failure, the major crack in the world's narrative. Maybe we have to become utopian idealists again, like our great-grandparents, and harbor the conviction that what is unrealized is better than what is real, or even than what is possible. Charles Fourier might not have had his last word yet. Maybe he was not 50 years ahead of his time, but 200. Leaving it up to our children and grandchildren to realize the utopian lifestyle defined in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. At this point, maybe it's time to exit the building, leave the premises. We need some fresh air. We need some fresh air. If you find your way out, please let us know. But don't call us, we'll call you. It was a pleasure having you here. Have a nice day.